Welcome to UT Brainstorms, the YouTube live version. My name is Mike Mauk. I'm a professor in the Department of Neuroscience at UT Austin. And UT Brainstorms is sponsored by the Department of Neuroscience, and it's our way of reaching out and sharing our interests and love of neuroscience with non-scientists. It's important to us that Brainstorms is a conversation. There's a reason why conversation is in the title of Brainstorms. Certainly, we want to share with you our interest and passion and excitement about neuroscience, but it's also true that we learn a great deal listening to you, from your questions, from the stories you tell, and from interacting with you. It's certainly one of the reasons why we look forward to the days when we can be back in the LBJ auditorium on the UT campus and get the full experience. But for now, thank you for being here. Thank you for sticking with us through this less than optimal venue. And it's just great to have the chance to do this. So we have a fun topic tonight. I'm both the presenter and the MC, so you're stuck with me. We're going to talk about stress and learning and dealing with things in a non-optimal circumstance. So let's get started with that. Let me share my screen. So hopefully now you see what I see, which is my PowerPoint presentation. So welcome again. I always want to start by thanking these two people, Laura Anian and Elena Silva. These are members of our staff in the Department of Neuroscience, and they do all the work. They work so hard on Brainstorms and put so much passion into it, and it's part of the reason why it's easy for people like me to participate in Brainstorms, is that they do so much. So thank you both, Laura and Elena. So some of you may remember that we sponsored a Brainstorms in January. It seems like 500,000 years ago, but just January 2020, we did this Brainstorms on the student brain, and we talked about effective studying. And in that Brainstorms, as part of our discussion, we asked people to imagine the typical student and how they study and prepare for exams. And you know, what we all closed our eyes and imagined, of course, is that there's your student working hard, diligently, reading their notes over and over again for many hours the day before the exam. And we talked about how that's pretty close to the worst possible way to study. And we talked a lot in that Brainstorms about better ways based on what's known from cognitive neuroscience and from neuroscience. We're going to talk about that towards the end. But what we've tried to do with these Brainstorms that are in this era, this crazy era, is that we've tried to make them relevant in some way to the craziness going on. We've had Brainstorms on COVID itself and vaccines, on stress. And so we wanted this one to be about stresses that relate to learning. We're all, so many of us, trying to either teach or to learn in the non-optimal circumstance of doing things online and not interacting in person. And so tonight, that's what we're about then, is to draw some cognitive neuroscience and neuroscience into a discussion about how we can do a better job under these non-optimal circumstances. So this is the kind of classroom we're used to, engaging in-person class. This is a picture of me teaching Neural Systems 1 at the University of Texas. So that's not true. And there are at least 3 reasons why you can tell that's not true, from least to most obvious. This isn't neuroscience. This is obviously, whatever this is, it's a little easier than neuroscience. Next, tie, wearing a tie. And most obvious of all, way too much hair. So this is the kind of thing we're used to, and classrooms are engaging and fun. But of course, these days, for the foreseeable future, this is what a classroom looks like, and everybody agrees that this isn't optimal. Teachers are trying hard, professors are trying hard to do their best, students the same. We all agree that we're doing what we can, but it's not optimal. And so what I want to do now is similar to what we did in January, which is I want you to imagine the typical student in this circumstance learning over Zoom in a remote classroom situation. And so here's how I imagine their typical behavior. They're in a Zoom class, their camera's off, their phone's right there. And I don't know, I see this a lot even before COVID. They're streaming their favorite Netflix series in the background of their computer while they're studying. They're stressed. We're all stressed. I see my daughters. I have a daughter who's supposed to be in Seattle at the University of Washington. Meanwhile, she's starting her freshman year in college from our back porch, worried about when she can go. We're all worried about things. So we're worried about COVID and stressed about that and about 28 other things. On top of that, we're cooped up at home. We're probably not exercising or sleeping as well as we should. And so one of the themes of tonight then is all of these things are bad. All of them interfere with good learning. And of course, on top of everything else, in addition to that, that we may not be studying optimally, just like we talked about in January. So these are the four things that I want to talk about tonight, is the effects of distraction, of stress, and exercise and sleeping on learning, and what we can, some thoughts about what we can do. And then finally, thinking about what neuroscience says about the best ways to study and to learn. So let's talk about distraction. And I can't help, every time I do, I'm drawn to this study that was done right here at the University of Texas campus by researchers in the Mauk School of Business. Fascinating study where they were asking about distraction from our smartphones. And so the experiment is they devised a cognitively challenging task. It has various components. You'll see some of those shortly. They had 3 groups of 100, so 300 subjects, 3 groups of 100, randomly assigned to one of 3 groups that differed only in terms of the whereabouts of their smartphone while they were taking this test. One group had their phone on the desk. One group had their phone in a purse or bag close to them. And the third group was asked to leave their phone outside of the test-taking room. Here's some of the results of that. And what you'll see is some complicated things about different kinds of learning and cognition. But in each case, what we see is increasing performance as we go from the phones on the desk to the phone is in a bag to the phone is in the other room. So the graph on the left, this was a working memory task. Working memory is a form of memory that we use to, as we think about things, holding onto a phone number while we're dialing is a trivial example. Working memory impaired by having your phone close to you. Fluid intelligence, I had to look this one up, but fluid intelligence is a cognitive psychology term that's about connecting the dots, making connections between things that maybe aren't obvious. Again, clearly not a good idea to have your phone next to you. Now, there's some really interesting things about this. So first of all, nobody during these tests looked at their phone or touched their phones. They were all asked in a questionnaire if their phone, they felt distracted by their phone. Very few of them mentioned that they felt distracted by their phone, and there were no differences in the level of that between these 3 groups. So really one of for me, the take-home messages of this kind of work is that number one, distraction is the enemy of focus. It gets in the way of what we do. And I think worse, distraction is insidious in the sense that we don't even realize how much it affects us. These people reported that their phones were not a distraction. And yet the closer their phone was to them, without even touching it, the less well they did on these cognitively challenging tasks. So one thing we can do, clearly, take some discipline, clearly within our control though, is that we can try to eliminate distraction when we're trying to learn and study and teach even. So let's talk about stress. First thing I want to say about that is that one of our panelists, Michael Drew, did Brainstorms just recently, and this is his first slide from that. A whole Brainstorms about stress and its effect on learning and memory. You can find those at utbrainstorms.com. There's the, I don't know why I put that there because you can't click on it, but it's on the YouTube channel that we have. So if we talk about stress, really, we want to go straight to the hippocampus. And if you've been to some Brainstorms, you've heard us talk about the hippocampus many times. The hippocampus is a brain structure deep in the brain, only part of it shown here. This is the ventral hippocampus. There's a dorsal hippocampus up here. Very clear, without any ambiguity, that the hippocampus is important for memory and even for particular kinds of memories. The most obvious and one of the earliest ways that we notice that is from the work of Dr. Brenda Milner. She studied this guy, Henry Molaison, who in his early 20s had both of his hippocampi removed as a way to try to deal with intractable epilepsy. And Brenda Milner studied him for over 25 years. And the specific memory deficit that he had, it was bloody clear that there was a problem in the sense from the time that he woke up from his surgery through the rest of his life, he never formed a new long-term memory. So he had intact memory for events. He could retrieve memories for events before his surgery, but from the time he woke up, he never stamped in a new long-term memory. So as an example, she tells anecdotes about every day, despite having worked with him 5-6 days a week for decades, she would walk in and introduce herself to him, and he would stand up and say, "It's nice to meet you," as if he had no memory of them meeting whatsoever. Now, one of the subtler things that we learned from Dr. Milner's work is that there's different kinds of memories, and not all of them are mediated by the hippocampus. The term declarative memory has been given to one of the kinds of memories, and so an example of that we can get from one of the clever observations that Dr. Milner made. She had Henry Molaison do this puzzle. This is the Hauer of Hanoi puzzle. There's a set of rules for how you transfer all of the rings from the left rod to the right rod. In this seven ring version, the optimal strategy involves 127 moves. And the quick story is that every day she brought it in, every day he's reported, "Yeah, I've never played this before." But over many weeks, as he played it every day, he eventually started to doing it in 127 moves. So he had an unconscious memory, an implicit memory for this game, and could do it. He apparently would even joke that, "Oh, I seem to be pretty good at this," but he had no declarative or conscious memory that he had done it. Now, what's interesting then is declarative memories. These are the kind of memories that we're trying to form when we study and learn. These are the things, when I prepare a lecture, I'm using declarative memories to say the things that I say. We're asking students to form new declarative memories as they learn so that they can perform well on exams. And so the hippocampus is relevant entirely. So the bottom line then is stress is bad for the hippocampus. And this was what Michael Drew talked about quite a bit in his recent Brainstorms. I'm going to show one example of that, of how that works. So the hippocampus has a dorsal version, which is not clear here, and a ventral portion, which is shown in pink here. As it turns out, they mediate the dorsal and ventral hippocampus, different aspects of declarative memory. The dorsal hippocampus is more of the cognitive memories, again, the kinds that we would be asking students to form to do well and to learn and to do other classes. The ventral hippocampus is important for more emotional memories. And an interesting thing about stress is a little bit of stress is okay. But beyond a certain point, the stress hormones have an effect on the hippocampus where they essentially suppress the dorsal hippocampus's ability to form memories and enhance the ventral hippocampus's ability to do emotional memories, really skews our memories away from cognitive memories more towards emotional memories. So if you're stressed, you might have strong memories of being nervous about the exam coming up. That's of little use for you. But you're going to have difficulty with the very kind of memories that are important for exams and for learning the cognitive memories. And so it's important to keep stress down. So when we think about the hippocampus, we have the advantage that we know a lot about the cells and even the circuit diagram. So here's a cartoon of the circuit diagram that we teach our students about the hippocampus. So here's some fibers coming in and some cells, different kinds of cells processing things. One of the most important parts of the hippocampus is shown here. This DG stands for dentate gyrus. It's a layer of cells. These are called granule cells, and they're an important part of the processing of the hippocampus. One interesting thing about these granule cells is that it's one of the rare instances in the brain where you have new granule cells being born as an adult. This is called adult neurogenesis. It's a very important part of how the hippocampus does the memory things that it does. And in fact, Michael Drew is one of the world's authorities on adult neurogenesis in the hippocampus. And here's another pretty picture of the hippocampus. These are actual hippocampal neurons, and they're glowing green from a dye that's been injected them. Here are these granule cells of the dentate gyrus. Many of these were born in adulthood. They weren't present when the animal was born. They're always being formed. Long story short, in ways that aren't fully understood, stress inhibits adult neurogenesis, and that's one of the ways that it is going to get in the way of memories. And so those newly born neurons are important for forming new memories. And if you're not making enough of them, if stress is causing that, then it gets in the way of forming new memories. One of the other things that interferes with adult neurogenesis is as we get older, it goes down. People my age start complaining about how we just don't remember things as well, and this is part of the reason. So you younger people, one way to think of this is that if you let your stress level rise too high, then you've turned your young, pliable, smart brain into an older, less effective brain. And you don't want to do that. You can't perform well under those circumstances. So that's just a little bit of neuroscience behind why stress interferes with our ability to learn and to remember. So what can we do about it? So one obvious thing is exercise. Now, there's kind of a trivial reason for that. Exercise helps reduce stress. I know this is certainly true for me. It's one of the most important things that I employ to try to keep my stress down. But there's more to it than that. Turns out exercise affects the hippocampus itself directly. One of the ways, maybe one of the most important ways, is that it enhances adult neurogenesis. So stress interfering with the new birth of these cells in adulthood, exercise helps with that. So exercise can calm you down. It can be a signal to your hippocampus to get back to work and make those new cells, and let's form those new memories. So exercise, important aspect. Sleep's another important one. Sleep helps reduce stress. But again, like exercise, sleep plays an important role in the way our brains learn and remember. Not fully understood, but there's clear evidence from a whole variety of different kinds of experiments that our memories are consolidated and improved and stamped in more strongly somehow during sleep. And there's some fascinating, this isn't fully understood, but there's some fascinating examples of this. Really, some of the most interesting neuroscience experiments that I've ever read that come from recording from the hippocampi in mostly in rodents and rats and mice. Turns out one of the things about that we discover is that a lot of neurons in the hippocampus care about where we are. They're called place cells, and it's not fully understood why a part of the brain that's important for memory is also going to be wrapped up in where we are in place, but it just is. Maybe we have to put our memories into a context of where it happened, for example. But here's the idea behind place cells. So you have a rat, and you have ways of recording many neurons at once. So you can see their little spikes of voltage that when they're active, when they're signaling what's going on. And if you did that and you let a rat run around in an arena, what you would find is each of the neurons would have a particular place in that arena that they would fire. So what this cartoon shows then is each of these dots indicates the place where the animal was when one of the neurons fired, and they're color coded by which neurons. So there's 8 neurons here that we're imagining were being recorded. And so the purple neuron, most of its activity occurred when the animal was here, and then the yellow, and you can see teal and green and all on around. And they don't have to be lined up in a track like that. You'll see the purpose for the track in a second. If we got rid of the track and let the animal just wander around, we might find yet another place cell that is only active when the animal's over here or down here, etc. But what's interesting, and how the track was exploited to think about these things, is that if you're recording from an animal and it's got place cells that fire when it's at different places on a track like this, if you've trained a rat to run down this track, maybe because it's expecting food at the end, and you do that over and over during a training session during the day, then because by virtue of these cells care about place and the animal's traversing space, they're going to fire in a particular sequence. In our imaginary experiment here, the purple neuron would fire, then the yellow, then teal, then green, then red, and then all the way to the other yellow, and then back, and then so over and over again, the neurons would fire in that sequence, simply because they're programmed to fire for that spot, and we're asking the animal to run through the same set of spots over and over again. Now, here's the amazing discovery. Turns out one of the things that happens in the hippocampus when an animal is at rest or asleep is there's an electrical phenomenon called sharp wave ripples. He's very brief, about quarter-second ripples, and neurons can do their action potential spiky thing during those ripples, but they're only present when the animal's resting and asleep. And here's the astonishing discovery. So people were doing these experiments. Here's another cartoon for the kind of experiment I was just describing, recording from maybe a dozen different cells, and you have the animal run through a track, and you find that the blue one, there's one that fires when the animal's here, there's one that fires when the animal's here, so there's a sequence, and you have them do that over and over again. You come back a while later when the animal's resting, and what you find is during those sharp waves, which only last about a quarter of a second. This might have taken 10, 15 seconds for the sequence to play out. That same sequence is played out during the sharp wave. So it's as if the hippocampus is rehearsing or remembering that sequence that it ran through, maybe almost like a dream. And again, the relationship to memory and the precise purpose of this is not fully understood, but clearly the hippocampus is rehearsing things that happened during the day. It's replaying what happened, and this is undoubtedly a part of how sleep is important, how memories are consolidated during sleep. This is called hippocampal replay. By the way, I noticed some of you are asking questions in the chat. That was an omission by me. Feel free to start typing questions in now. You'll just get a head start on when we start doing the question and answer later. So if a question pops in your head, by all means, answer it now. So hippocampus, Stress, bad. Exercise, good. Sleep, good, partly because it reduces stress, partly because our hippocampi need sleep to do some of the things that do, replaying and memory consolidation being two. So just as a little summary then, distraction and stress are the enemies of learning and memory. Exercise and sleep are good. We got to get rid of stress. We got to have the discipline to get rid of distraction. Exercise always helps, and do not cheat yourself with sleep. I tell my students in my classes, do not stay up late the night before the exam studying. You're far better served to study ahead of time, and then the best thing you can do the night before an exam is to get a good night's sleep. So now we're at the point where I'm going to reprise what we talked about last January. I'm going to give you just the short version of what neuroscientists and cognitive neuroscientists know about effective ways to learn and to study and ineffective ways. And I find that a useful starting place for that discussion is to remind ourselves of one counterintuitive thing, which is as impressive as our memories are, our brains are designed to forget almost everything we experience. If you think about the vast number of experiences in your life, you have memories of only a small fraction of them. In fact, our brains have a set of rules that they implement for determining what's worth forgetting and what's worth remembering. And really, good study practices involve knowing those rules and exploiting them. You're really, if you know those rules, you're really tricking your brain into saying, please don't forget this. This needs to be remembered. So what are those rules? We won't go into much of the neuroscience, but let me summarize them for you. So maybe first and foremost, what's known is that the idea of retrieval practice, which is the worst thing that you can do to study is just read your notes over and over again. That's not retrieval, you're just sort of looking at it. Much better, anything that you do to recall a memory from your own mind first is better. So for example, rather than sitting down and reading your notes, sit down and first thing you do is try to recall from memory what the notes say. What are the key facts? What were the concepts? What were the bullet points that I was supposed to remember? Even if you do that poorly, and then of course you would look and see what did I get right? What did I forget? What could I have added to that? The counterintuitive thing is even if you do that poorly, as you might when you first sit down to start studying, that's far better studying than just looking at your notes. And so that's true just in terms of, that's one of the cues to our brains to remember something, is that we keep asking our brains to recall it. So that's a cue to stamp it in stronger. Probably talking to the hippocampus. One of the other important things about this is that there are different aspects to our memories, and one of them is as we discussed, is these episodic memories, these long-term memories where we can recall an episode or a fact or a concept. Another is that's quite distinct is we have a sense of familiarity that we can learn as we experience things. And this is really one of the big problems, is that we obtain a sense of familiarity relatively quickly when we experience things. And this is what happens, I think, when people study by just reading their notes over and over. They fairly rapidly acquire a sense of familiarity. They get a sense that things are going well, and that, I mean, those notes are so familiar, I should probably stop studying. I know this. Fact is that sense of familiarity is fleeting. It's easy to acquire, it's easy to forget, and it's actually not the kind of memory that we need to recall facts and to do well on exams. But in a almost perverse way, it gives the student the sense, the incorrect sense that they know well. And in fact, this is one of the things, maybe one of the controversial things that I spoke about in the Brainstorms in January, is it's my own sense that this is the basis for a lot of test anxiety. There are people who are anxious, but I think a lot of test anxiety arises, at least initially, from this mismatch of when people study poorly, non-optimally, they walk in with a sense that they're much better prepared than they really are. And that mismatch hits them in the face as they take the exam. And one explanation is, well, I must have test anxiety. I sure knew this stuff. Why couldn't I recall it on the exam? The fact is that the reality is that you didn't know it as well as you thought you did. Retrieval practice, very important. So as it turns out, just in general, learning is better and stamped in more durably if learning is effortful. So just anything that you can do to interact with material, connect it with what you already know. As it turns out, analogy is an important example of this. I would have told you years ago that one of my bad habits as a lecturer is that I'm just fond of analogies. I just go there. I tend to throw them out, and I truly thought that was a bad habit that I should work on breaking. Turned out, quite accidentally, I was wrong. Analogy is a powerful tool. It helps us connect what we're learning with what we already know, makes connections. Connections is where memories come from. So interacting with material, imagining it, repeating it back to yourself, connecting it to what you already know, imagining an analogy of a similar concept, all quite powerful and effective. Really important and powerful concept of spaced versus massed practice. Simple way to think about this is if you've got 6 hours, say, total to study for an exam, don't sit down and study for 6 straight hours. In fact, anything that you do beyond about 45 minutes is diminishing return. It's almost a waste of time. Much better, don't even study for 2 3-hour sessions. Break up your day into 8 45-minute sessions with breaks in between. There's also the concept of interleaving, which is related. Say you have 2 exams, 2 different classes coming up on Monday, and you have the weekend to study and maybe about 6 hours to devote to each class. Don't study for 6 hours on Saturday for one, 6 hours for the other. Study for 45 minutes for one, take a little break, study for 45 minutes for the other, go back to the first, mix in a little exercise in there, make sure you get a good night's sleep, but interleave 45 minutes at a time. Anything you do beyond that, you're not getting your money's worth in terms of sitting down and studying. Also, of course, during that 45 minutes, focus, get rid of distractions. This is the one more maybe for instructors and professors than it is for students, but there's a good deal of evidence that shows that if we try to solve a problem, even unsuccessfully before we're taught about it, we just learn it better. It's almost as if having struggled with it and failing, and then when we're told the answer, we kind of smack ourselves in the forehead and say, of course, and then something about that smacking of the forehead makes us understand it better. Students hate this, but many of the homeworks in my class, I just give them a virtual experiment and say, discover something. Drives them crazy. They don't know what they're looking for. It's a hard problem. They don't solve it. Maybe they're even a little frustrated with me, but then the next class, when we talk about it, what they don't realize is that it's stamping in deeper and they understand it better because of the effort. So, and then don't forget sleep and exercise. So let me just sum up, and I want to connect the things that we've been talking about now to the theme of these brainstorms that is that coping with what's going on. So these are just some my thoughts now based on what we've been talking about, for what it's worth. So when we're facing challenges, we can't afford any avoidable difficulties. We can't give away anything that we don't need to. So if we're learning under non-optimal circumstances of in front of Zoom and are not in a classroom, we can't interact with our professor enough or our students enough, our fellow students enough. We can't afford to give away more by being distracted, having our phone near, being stressed, not exercising. So we have to opt. The harder things get, the more we have to cut out everything that we can so that our strategy is close to optimal as possible. Also, when we're facing a lack of control, that's what these days feel like a little bit. Everything's out of our control. We can't do the things we want to do. When's it going to change? We don't know. When can I go to Seattle to start college? Don't know. best to focus on the things that we can control. And I think one of the good news about what we've talked about tonight is the things that I told you about that interfere with learning, and that what we can do to overcome them, and the best ways to study, are all things under our control. So in these non-optimal times, we can work harder at removing distractions. Get your focus on. That's controllable. That's something we can do. We can work hard to reduce stress, and two great ways to do that for a variety of reasons: exercise and sleep, both powerful aids to learning and memory. And then I just threw them to be a little smug as a neuroscience. You want to study like a neuroscientist. Don't study longer and harder, study smarter. Use these things that we know about that trick our brains into remembering things. Make that the basis for how you study, which mostly means a little bit at a time, and always using recall techniques. Those are things we can control, and those are things that we can do to fight back and to do better despite things not being so great. All 2 cents from me. So thanks for your attention. As we transition now into introducing our 3 panelists, I want to just throw in a pitch that this is the next Brainstorms. It'll happen November 12th. We've invited one of our colleagues from the UT Austin Dell Medical School, Dr. Esther Melamed. She's an MD PhD, and she studies the brain, but she also sees patients on the neurology clinic, and she's going to talk to us about the implications of COVID on brain health. It's one that none of us are going to want to miss. Then finally so pretty soon, in just a second, our 3 panelists are going to turn on their cameras and microphones and get started. Let me introduce them as they get ready to do that. So our first panelist is professor and good friend, Michael Drew, in the Department of Neuroscience. He's an associate professor in the Department of Neuroscience, also one of our associate chairs. He's one of the world's authorities on the hippocampus and adult neurogenesis. He's also an annoyingly good tennis player, as it turns out. And he's been a speaker many times, panelist many times. You'll see that he'll be quite valuable tonight. Our second panelist is Dr. Caitlin Orsini. She's a new assistant professor in the Department of Psychology, and she's a member of the Wagner Center for Alcohol and Addiction Research. It's the fact that we're able to hire people like Caitlin that's a reminder that the neuroscience community in UT Austin is really strong. It was a real coup to be able to hire her. She's an expert on many things, including decision making and sex differences. She'll have a lot of great input tonight. And then finally, our third panelist is Emma Brockway. She's a graduate student, PhD student in Michael Drew's lab. So you can imagine then that she studies the hippocampus and adult neurogenesis, and she's a budding expert in those areas. She's also, frankly, one of our very best graduate students here at UT. So it's nice to have her as well. So I'm going to unshare my PowerPoint now. And Michael, Caitlin, and Emma, turn on your, there we are. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for being here. I'm gonna click to this chat. And so please continue to type in your questions, and it's gonna be my job to filter through them. I'll read them, and then Michael, Caitlin, and Emma are gonna pop in and give you amazing answers. So let's start one. So this is from Kristen Patterson, who is a colleague of ours at UT. She's a really brilliant teacher and professor here at UT. And Kristen's question is, what does the data show about phone proximity say about trying to teach, learn using technology? So in other words, we're using technology to do things like Zoom and such. So does any of you know anything about that?
Well, I'll make myself look foolish here. I was hoping you wouldn't ask me that one because That was I was watching your talk, and actually that study about the cell phone, that was the first time I'd heard about that, and that was fascinating. And actually, through the talk, my mind was sort of spinning and thinking about the different mechanisms for that effect. Why is it no good to have it in your pocket even? I suspect that we're all in big trouble. And as a teacher, this is something I always think about, because when we're in the classroom, and now especially when we're teaching in Zoom, almost all of our students have a computer or a phone in their hand, and they're taking notes. Hopefully, I just assume they're taking notes, but who knows? Maybe they're watching Netflix, like you said. And I don't have an answer to that, but I'm interested to hear if one of the other panelists want to chime in on that one.
I don't have a neuroscience answer, but I think it's pretty clear that having phones and laptops closer and all of our learning on a laptop is distracting. Even if you have nothing else up, maybe you see notifications, maybe you're getting emails more easily and you're more inclined to read them. So although technology could be useful and we're still able to have class, it's also just a distraction in lots of different ways. There might be ways to get around that, but
I mean, I think also, when I was teaching, the majority of my class, they take notes on their computer. And I think there's data out there to show that the retention that students take away from even just, and I'm not, not even just having a phone there, but using technology to take notes. So some of these things that seem to be advances actually are not great for retention and memory. So there is that aspect. I think it really depends on what you're using the technology for. So there are a lot of apps that are actually very good. For example, for learning languages, and some of it is because there's active learning going on. But if you have multiple sources of technology with you, you're going to put a bigger cognitive load on yourself, and that's just going to limit your attention.
I want to add one thing. Is as you guys were talking, it spurred my recollection, and I think one of the it's counterintuitive, but an important aspect of learning is, we usually think of stamping in acquiring memory as the most important part of memory, but actually practicing retrieving the memory is also very important. And I noticed, just speaking as a learner, kind of taking off my neuroscientist cap, I know that having my computer at my fingertips, I'm much less likely to try to engage in that effortful retrieval process. Like, it, as so happens more and more often for me, if I can't remember a word or I can't remember somebody's name, I just Google them, and I don't get the advantage of that retrieval practice. And I wonder if that's another thing that's going on when the students always have the computer or the phone at their fingertips.
The smarter our devices get, maybe the stupider we get. We have to be careful about that. That's a good one. So here's maybe a question that's for Emma and Michael. So people want to know, how do we encourage the adult neurogenesis? So I know that you guys know a lot about that. So I mentioned stress, I mentioned exercise, but there's a lot known about this. So several of the questions are about that.
I'll leave that one to Michael to begin with.
I'll go, Emma.
I mean, you hit on a lot of the big ones that we know, or the ones that have been studied the most. Exercise really helps. I think how to generate more granule cells isn't necessarily the way to think about it, as, how can we live to best have healthy lives? And those are usually the answers. So things like sleep and exercise that we've talked about. Something, Mike, when you were talking, that I kind of thought about too is healthy eating. I don't think we have direct connections necessarily to neurogenesis, but I know related to stress, if you eat more or eat less, that is going to affect your stress levels. So I would probably jump to assume that, that could also factor into this. If we're kind of lumping together stress and learning and hippocampal function. Sleep, eating, food are all very important. Just have normal, regular cycles.
Yeah. So as a corollary, so one of the questions which I appreciate because it's a reminder of some things I forgot to say. How much sleep? How much exercise? I know that Michael spoke about that some in your previous brainstorms.
Does Caitlin want to say anything about that? Looked like you were starting to.
No. I was just smiling because I saw the question, but I do know that, there's a point at which, at least for exercise, that it's very important for exercise, not only just for memory, but cardiovascular health, et cetera. But there is a point at which too much exercise or kind of forced exercise can actually be detrimental and kind of reverse some of these helpful effects that we know are associated with exercise. So that was kind of what I was thinking about, is that there sometimes is too much of a good thing, and it's reflected in kind of reverses and the changes in the brain that we associate with improvement in memory and helping with stress.
Yeah, I got to add to that. Well, I'm a big advocate for the importance of adult neurogenesis. This is a big part of what we research in my lab, but I always have to throw out the caveat that almost everything we know about adult neurogenesis comes from studies in rats and mice. And, a rat and mouse brains are a lot like a human brain. Okay. Don't get me wrong, but they're not the same. And so we don't know really, these fine-grained questions about how much exercise should we get. It's really hard to know how to translate the findings in a mouse to what does that mean for a human. And then I'll say, the mice that we use in the laboratory, they love to run. There are mice that will run 10 kilometers a day, which I actually spent the time to figure out how that translates into a human in terms of like the stride length. And it was something like over 100 kilometers for a human. So it's an insane amount. One thing that we do know from the mouse and the rat studies is that variation is important. So if you have the mouse doing the same exercise over and over again, or the same cognitive task over and over again, they don't have a sustained benefit in neurogenesis. It habituates, right? It sort of returns back to normal. And so you need to keep on, I think this is probably true for humans too. I can't prove it, but you need to keep on challenging yourself. And so if you're a runner, that may mean that you need to take up something else. And if you're challenging your mind, that stimulates neurogenesis in our mice. But if you do the same thing over and over again, it won't keep on stimulating. So if you do crossword puzzles, maybe you need to change to Sudoku or whatever.
Right.
I kind of want to piggyback off of that. I think there's ways you could subtly change routines also. So if you imagine running around the block every single day, that's not going to stimulate you the same way as finding a new park and running there would do. So novelty also might help. I don't necessarily know if this is related to neurogenesis in the literature, but novelty and having things to interact with in your environment contribute to not being as stressed in mouse models and probably, I would assume, in humans. So having just new and interesting things to engage with, even if we're stuck in our houses or in our own neighborhoods, we can kind of find ways to work that into our exercise routines. Since someone did ask how much sleep and exercise to get, I am not a doctor. You probably want to ask one of those, but even doing like 30 minutes of exercise a day is helpful. A lot of people need 7.5 to 8 hours of sleep, maybe more if you're younger and less if you're older.
All right, so I want to ask this question in part because I'm curious to see if our panelists even know what this is. So for retrieving and recalling memories, when it comes to studying, is Quizlet great or harmful? Is there a better way than using Quizlet? Who knows what Quizlet is? I have daughters, so I know. Quizlet is basically an electronic flashcards, more or less. So
I think it's helpful. Again, variety might be good, but I do find that flashcards are a great way to create your own recall exercise, especially if you can come up with the questions. So if you go through your notes and you can say, okay, here are my questions, and this is going to prompt me to have to come up with this information and recall it, that is a great way to study notes. Since I'm not exactly sure with Quizlet, it seems like they have some pre-made sets of information. So maybe that doesn't one-to-one, help you study for a class, but if it's teaching you science concepts, that might still be a great way to learn things. And they have games and things, which just keeps you more engaged in the task.
Yeah.
I wouldn't use it as your only study tool, but.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think just in general, using something like Quizlet is there. I think there's evidence that, and maybe Mike, you can speak to this based on your UT Brainstorms in January, but using those kinds of mechanisms to help study rather than just reading notes, whether it's Quizlet or index cards, that's actually been shown to be really helpful. So, just that concept in general.
I also was going to say, so I didn't know, I'll confess, I didn't know what Quizlet was, but I do think that flashcards are great. And one of the reasons they're great is because of this trial spacing effect that Mike talked about. And actually, there's another nuance to the trial spacing effect, and that what's actually what's more important than the spacing itself is that what you want to do is modulate the spacing between trials so that you're sort of maximizing the how challenging it is to retrieve, right? And so in other words, like, and I'm thinking back, there are these beautiful studies years ago in infants by scientist Carolyn Rove Collier, and she was teaching infants like a new motor skill. And one of the things she found is that the practice was most effective if she spaced out the trials just long enough until the infants just about forgot the skill. So they'd learn it once, they'd wait a few days, and they'd almost forget it, and then they'd have another practice session. That was the most efficient way to get the infants to learn this. And so you can easily do that when you're using flashcards.
On the flashcard discussion, I think this is another thing that we might be able to do now that everything's online. Have physical notes, have physical flashcards. It might be a good break from the screen. And flashcards are nice, similar to the whole spacing and trial spacing of how you're studying. You can modulate not just your entire study session, but you can modulate which things you're studying. So if you get a flashcard right, you can put it in one pile. But if you get a flashcard wrong, you can put it in a different pile. Do the ones you get wrong more, and then go back and do the easy ones when you have less time. And then if you get an easy one wrong, put it back in the wrong pile. So the flashcards are actually a great way to modulate just how spaced out you're looking at the information.
Cool. So here's a question that I think is a segue from this idea about learning being difficult and effortful. So there's a question here about what about various types of learners, like auditory and visual, tactile, etc. And I'll just say one little thing in the beginning, which is it annoys people, but counterintuitively, the evidence suggests that we shouldn't gear our learning towards our favorite. It's actually because that's the easiest one. Actually, you should pick the hardest and least effective way that you learn, because that counterintuitively will stamp in memories deeper. So this whole trend of gearing our teaching towards what somebody's apparent best mode is actually exactly wrong. So what about decision making, Caitlin? Does any of this sort of like fold in? Is the same true for decision making, or that's kind of an obtuse distinction, but
in terms of different learning styles, is that what you mean?
Yeah, or just are difficult decisions somehow easier to navigate than easy decisions? There's this difficulty factor when we think about memory.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, that's a good question. And I think sometimes when I think about kind of easy and hard decisions, some of it is just based on experience. When you're encountering something new, regardless of kind of what the costs or the rewards that are involved, it's going to be challenging. And then the more often that I mean, there's a learning component to decision making, and so the more that you experience it, sort of like Emma was saying, in different environments with different stimuli, the better you are going to learn that, and using different, making sure you're kind of tapping into different sensory modes will also help. To the point at which, sometimes these decisions become habitual. And I could go into a longer spiel about how that can lead to problems down the line. But yeah, I mean, memories are very much involved in making decisions. I don't think we clearly have a really good way of dissociating those, and figuring out where they live in the brain. But I think a lot of kind of what we're talking about here also can apply to like learning in how we make decisions. If that answers your question.
Yeah, great. Lovely. So here's a great question and a classic question you've all heard before. So is the new memory actually stored in the hippocampus, or is the hippocampus needed to store the memory somewhere else in the brain? Great question.
I think that's a pretty loaded question from what we understand now. So maybe the best answer there is both. The hippocampus does store a form of memory, but there's other structures within the brain that also might be involved in storing memory, especially on a longer term scale. So the hippocampus is needed for processing and forming memory and knowing where you are in space right then and recalling that information. But as time goes on and that memory is consolidated, other brain regions are kind of tag teamed into the storage of that memory. Mm-hmm. Also, depending on what kind of memory it is, the hippocampus is really good at spatial memory and the context you're in, but there's other brain regions that might store more emotional memories or connections between learned experience that you're afraid of that are also super important.
I think the one thing to think about when asking about this question, like where do certain things live in the brain, it is not just one brain region. It's really distributed across multiple circuits. And so maybe there's one brain region, particularly, for example, the hippocampus, where you're laying down some of these more short-term memories. But over time, it's going to be your other kind of distributed brain regions are going to be coming online. And and that's not a bad thing at all. That's how we make connections with other experiences. So I just wanted to kind of throw that out there, is that there's no one brain region where one thing lives. It actually can kind of become distributed across multiple, like a distributed network, if you will.
Great. So let's switch to stress briefly. This is a fascinating question. So what do we know about the effects of stress on the brains of younger people, such as elementary school age children? So while you guys are thinking about, let me say one thing. We did a Brainstorms in the past. One of our professors, Allie Preston, did a Brainstorms maybe a year ago, Michael? That was about the way children learn differently than adults, and that's available on YouTube. So you'd have a whole hour and a half of that topic if you wanted. But what do you guys have to say about stress in young people versus older?
I'm a little hesitant to weigh in actually on that one, because I mean, when I put my science hat on, when you say stress, we're usually talking about a pretty extreme form of stress. And so there's a lot of, I could cite, many papers studying effects of stress in juvenile and infant animals. And there are some important effects. There's interesting research showing that, stressful experiences early in life can really fundamentally change the organization of the brain. But I don't want to really talk about that because, we're all stressed right now, and our children are experiencing stress. My children are experiencing stress, and if it's of a completely different kind than what we study in the laboratory. And so, if I put my more parental hat on, I think of it another way as kids being actually really resilient to the types of stressors that most kids are going through right now.
Yeah.
And so, I just want to draw a distinction between the laboratory type of stress and the type of stress that a lot of us are experiencing right now.
That's a good point, though. I mean, I'm not as familiar with the wealth of human literature, but early life stress, looking at humans, you can sometimes look backwards in populations and say, okay, these students went through really traumatic issues or have had family stress, or there's a lot of different things that could, qualify as early life stress. But even then, we tend to look at the most extremes and try to figure out from there what that tells us. But a lot of those don't extrapolate directly to what's happening now. A lot of those are really looking at, traumatic situations that are going to influence your lifelong learning and how you think about things. But all in all, early life stress does have effects. I think the best things to do, like Michael was talking about, is work on resilience strategies. It's a good time to learn about how to deal with stress, and those experiences can also follow you through your life.
So let me try to combine a couple of questions. There was a question earlier about attention span and how long our attention span is, and I think that's relevant here because what I see with young kids grappling with learning on Zoom, it has as much to do with attention span as it does stress. So you guys want to weigh in a little bit about what neuroscientists know about attention span?
So I know that, before I came to the University of Texas, I was at the University of Florida in a lab that was looking at working memory. So the ability to hold information in mind for, shorter amounts of time. And we really, taxed animals and looked at their ability, how long and how well are they able to hold this memory in mind, or this information in mind. And some of the work they were doing was looking at stress, whether it's acute stress or chronic variable stress. And so by chronic variable stress, I mean experiencing different kinds of stress for a longer period of time. And it has an immense negative effect on working memory capacity. And it's actually exacerbated as you get older. So there is a clear relationship, and you can see this not only behaviorally, but you can see it when you're measuring hormones, you can see it when you're looking at areas of the brain. So it's a, again, this is where you want to, thinking about where we are now, thinking about ways to enhance resiliency, because there is this, very striking effect that stress kind of over the course of time can have on attention span and working memory.
I think one aspect of that too, thinking about stress and attention, when you're stressed, you have some things that are just constantly on your mind. So it might be hard to dedicate fully to the thing that you're doing right then. And having everything on the computer, your social life, your work life, your school life, all in the same place makes that more complicated. So it might help for attention right now to kind of separate out some of those things. I'm in a tiny apartment. It's hard for me to go from a desk to other places, but having physical settings or kind of putting yourself in a mindset might be able to help you separate out, put the stress away for a minute and I'm going to focus on this right now.
Very good. So there's a question from Nate on, for adult neurogenesis, is it more fruitful to study new topics or dive deeper into topics that you were already familiar with? And I know that you just talked about animal versus human studies, but just in thinking in terms of animal studies, what would you know about that?
That's a really good question. And, it's hard to answer, with the caveat, that these are animal studies for the most part. And it's really hard to teach mice to dive deeper into topics they're already familiar with. But I think, I would think both of those things are probably really valuable, right? I mean, for me, I always think of it as the element of a challenge, right? And you can challenge yourself by learning completely new things, but you can also challenge yourself by getting deeper into something you already know and taking it to a new level. One of the things that we know from the animal research is that the mechanisms of learning can be really different when you're learning something for the first time than when you're learning it for the second time. And that's actually, I'm always trying to take things back to the basic science, because that's what I do. So I'll take it back to the basic science. A lot of the work in animals is done when animals are learning something for the first time, right? So you take your mouse and you teach it a maze, and that's pretty much the only thing the mouse ever learns, right? And as people started to ask, well, what happens if I teach the mouse a second maze? What they discovered, they were really surprised to discover that the learning mechanisms were different in a fundamental way. And that can happen even when it's the same task. And so, you can have this one task that I talked about in one of my brainstorms, the water maze. When you have your mice learn the water maze in one room, and then you move them to a second room and they learn the water maze again, even though they're learning the maze, it's a different room. It tapped into completely different learning mechanisms. And so to me, that suggests that even if you're doing the same subject or the same topic, but you're doing it in a different context, you're looking at a different side of it, it could still challenge you in a unique way.
One of the interesting corollaries to that, one of the first things that people discovered using MRI functional imaging is that no matter how fluent a bilingual person is, if they learned the second language after about 10 or 11 years of age, it's a completely different system in the brain than the classic language system. So relearning and learning for the first time really are different animals in many respects. So we get a lot of questions in Brainstorms. You guys have seen this on things like meditation versus, and then we get a lot of questions about supplements, things that you take. So let's have that discussion for a bit. So anybody know anything about meditation, and we can talk a little bit about supplements then.
I give one thing that I'll say about meditation. Personally, I think it's valuable, but I was never really too interested or thoughtful about the neural mechanisms. But what I learned recently is that there's a very clear connection between our respiratory function and our sympathetic nervous system. And so apparently when you're breathing out, so one of the things I'm not an expert in meditation, but one of the things I've frequently heard when I've done meditation is they're always encouraging you to have your out breath be longer than your in breath. And I think one of the reasons is that during the out breath, you're actually suppressing your sympathetic nervous system. And your sympathetic nervous system is the part of the nervous system that's activated during a fight or flight stress response. And I'm not sure of the mechanism of that connection, but there's good. I looked up the science, and the science behind it seems pretty strong.
Yeah, I'm not as familiar with the science of it, but meditation, a lot of both what, any yoga person and some scientists are kind of looking at is breathing practices. So it's a regular, steady breath that what you're really trying to achieve in meditation. So breathing in, holding it, breathing out. And a lot of that is kind of calming yourself and just focusing on that. So we kind of tie all this back together. You're trying to focus on your breath and really only think about the function of your breath itself. So that reduces all of the distractions, all the stress you might be thinking about, and that might factor into it. But part of it is just going back to what we were saying earlier about sleep and exercise and eating. All of that is a normal pattern. So I think having breathing patterns with stress and anxiety and panic attacks, one thing that happens is you start to hyperventilate. By training yourself to breathe deeply, you actually can reduce anxiety and stress.
For the supplement question, I have to be honest, I don't know a lot about that. But what I would say, and I welcome other panelists to correct me if I'm wrong, but if I were to give advice, I would recommend actually some of the things that we've been talking about already. So some of these more natural remedies, exercise and sleep, and even actually some of the things that have really helped me through this pandemic is learning and taking up other hobbies that engage other parts of my brain. So painting and embroidery, which makes me sound like a really old person, but those are things that have actually been very stress relieving. And, these are all kind of natural, healthy things that we can do for our bodies that will relieve stress, help with cognitive function. I mean, there may be evidence for other supplements that may be just as helpful, but I can't really speak to the science, but that's kind of how I think about, natural ways like meditation, for example, that can help reduce stress and stress effects on cognition.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with, go ahead, Emma.
Yeah, I just want to piggyback off what Caitlin is saying. So I know a few nutritionists who have really mostly said that supplements are supplementary. So if you can get all of those things in your diet by eating healthy, that's totally great and fine. But if you don't get enough calcium, iron, all those other things, sometimes supplements can help you with that. So it's really all about just having a balance in your diet. And if that, gets you to the right balance, that's great. If it's going over that, maybe not helpful.
Yeah, Caitlin, I'm really with you. Many of our early brainstorms were about how can people, as they get older, we talk about Alzheimer's disease and dementia, and what can I do as I get older to hold on to my memory? And everybody wants a pill. And we've often preached the bad news that there is no pill. I'll quote one of my favorite neuroscientists. So I heard say one time that if there was a chemical that could circulate in our blood that made us smarter, we would have a gland that secreted it. So anybody who's trying to sell you a pill that makes you smarter, they're walk away. That's the bad news. The good news is what the things that you said: exercise, sleep, meditation. Those are all things. Doing something new. Those are all things we can do and control. And you don't have to buy them in a drugstore. You can just do them. So I love that. So I love this kind of next question. This is from a student, and it's less to a neuroscientist and more to a graduate student, to professors than necessarily neuroscience. But what are some of the habits and routines that you all recommend doing daily in order to thrive as a student and in life beyond? So we see students every day. We were once students. So what can you recommend to young students? What kind of habits can really help them?
Well, exercise. I think this has been a common theme. This is something that I've done, almost every day since I can remember. So I'm a runner, and this is for me kind of my meditation time. And this is really is an outlet that I really need. And I also, this may sound kind of hokey, but as you're a student in college or graduate school, or whatever, doing something that you enjoy also makes, enhances the chance of success and happiness. But again, I think I'm repeating the same thing, but exercise has been just a huge help for me, both, physically and mentally. And that's one of the things that, I definitely recommend.
Yeah. Emma, what about you? Worth repeating, by the way, Caitlin, thank you.
Definitely. I think one that's really important and that has really been cemented over this pandemic is the importance of daily behavioral patterns. So, before I was stuck in my apartment all the time, I would wake up, have my breakfast routine, go to campus. And that really shifts my brain from, okay, at home, I'm going to goof off or whatever. But when I'm at school or work or wherever you're focusing, that's where I do work. And that's kind of gotten lost in a lot of the pandemic. Now that everything is in our houses, everything's on the laptop. So having kind of a daily behavioral pattern of, okay, I'm still going to have my breakfast routine. Now I'm going to go sit at my desk. And then, in the afternoon, maybe I'll exercise. And having kind of this regular thing you do kind of, one, allows you to create separate spaces for this is when my brain is focusing, this is when my brain is not focusing, but just kind of gives you a normalcy to the day. So I think that really helps. And with that too, having times within that daily pattern where I do look at my phone and when I don't look at my phone. People say like, don't look at your phone or a laptop 30 minutes before going to bed, and that might help you sleep better. And I think that applies to every part of the day. Having kind of times when you do or don't do certain things really does help me focus on the things I'm doing at the time.
What about you, Michael?
I think I'll expand on the theme that Caitlin and Emma already touched on, this theme of sort of regularity. I always tell my students that, nothing that we ask you to learn in college or really after college or anytime is really that hard if you give yourself enough time. And, you could really learn anything if you just put in the time, and it doesn't mean cramming, right? It means this sort of space practice. And if you just make a little bit of time every day to study, to work on whatever it is you're trying to master, you're eventually going to get there. You can't rush it, but you will get there. And it's amazing how easy it is to, if you're not in a rush and you're willing to do a little bit every day, it's amazing how easy it is to get good at stuff. So I tell my students, if all you can master is 30 seconds of studying, do 30 seconds, and that's sort of a trick, because I know if my students do 30 seconds, they'll probably do a minute, and they do a minute, they'll probably do 2 minutes, but that's the idea.
Yeah, I'll say the same thing with different words. My observation is students who are organized do better than students who aren't. The students who are really smart but come to college and fall apart are often they're just disorganized. And that little bit every day thing, organization really facilitates that. So have a plan, be organized. Don't let yourself fall into the freedom of nobody's telling me what to do. Tell yourself what to do and have a plan. I think that's great. So let's go back to memory. Is there an upper cap to how many things we can learn at once?
Well, I think it really depends on kind of what memory system you're tapping into. So, for example, if we go back to working memory, there is kind of a limited amount that we can kind of hold in mind for a period of time. But then when you get to these other memory systems, whether it's, episodic or declarative, I mean, it's, I don't have a specific number for you, but it depends on how you learn it. I mean, you can you can learn and remember quite a lot of things. It really probably depends on how you are learning it. It gets back to, what Michael was saying, and what we've been talking about is how you can create more long-lasting memories depending on the way that you learn them. And maybe the other panelists can weigh into it a little bit more, but I think it really just depends on the system that you're talking about.
A great point there, though, Caitlin, of attention. So working memory, we're often thinking about, how much can I hold in mind at once, like a phone number, but there is some research looking at, when you're learning, where your attention is located is the thing that's going to get the best encoded in your memory. So you can't pay attention to everything going on at once. There definitely is a limit. If you just have a bunch of things trying to vie for that attention, the 1 or 2 or 3 you're able to actually look at is what you're going to remember. And I think that's important to keep in mind when we're doing Zoom school and things like that. If you just have a lecture running, but you're also looking at some other notes and thinking about your next class, your attention is not focused. So I think we don't necessarily have a number. We can't say how many things you can pay attention to at once, but how direct that focus is does seem to matter.
I think for declarative, if you're trying to learn something declarative, I really feel like it's really one thing. I mean, I think there have been studies looking at multitasking, and the upshot of those studies, I think, is that when people are multitasking, they're not really multitasking; they're switching between tasks. And so they're only focusing on one thing at a time, but they're switching. But when you switch, there are switching costs, right? And it's very tempting now, right? When we're having a Zoom meeting instead of an in-person meeting, you could always be checking your email in the background, or you can be working on something in the background. Nobody's the wiser, right? But I mean, I know I'm not the only one who's tried to do it, and you get burned because as much as you think you can be paying attention to that person that you're meeting with, you just can't, and it's so I really think in a fundamental way, at least for declarative types of things, it's got to be one at a time.
Really, multitasking in a way is a form of distraction. If you're that's the switching cost, is you're distracted. Each task is a distraction to the other one. So we had a question a while back from one of our regulars, Steve. You would all know him if you saw him. And Steve asked, so he was sort of interested in the mirror image of neurogenesis. He wanted to know about, is there a role for cell death in brain function or forgetting? And
I could say something about that. So so as a general rule, there's not a lot of cell death. As you're, unless in pathological situations, neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, obviously there you have cell death, but in normal situation in aging, you don't have a whole lot of cell death. So when we move to the hippocampus specifically, there is a small amount of cell death that happens over time. And adult neurogenesis seems to compensate for that, but it's not a one-to-one relationship. And in fact, there's probably more neurogenesis than there is cell death, which suggests that the two processes are not driving each other. And at least in the animal studies, the hippocampus actually grows a small amount with age. That is probably due to neurogenesis happening. As to whether the cell death in your hippocampus, so the small amount of cell death that's happening, is it functionally important? We don't really know, because it's really hard to manipulate that process in a clean way. So nobody has been able to do a study where we really selectively prevent cell death without mucking up a whole bunch of other things. So we don't know, but some people have theorized that cell death might be a way, Emma mentioned before about how your hippocampus in some ways is a temporary memory store. And one of the ideas out there is that this cell death might play a role in sort of expunging old memories and sort of opening up space for new memories, but that's really speculative.
Cool. So we're getting close to the finish line here. So this is an important sounding question, but we're going to have to keep the answers fairly short. Apologies. But the question is about anxiety and depression and how that affects attention span. And I'm going to throw in the hippocampus. So we've talked about stress, but what about anxiety and depression?
I think, one, this is a loaded question. There's so much we could talk about in the last 2 minutes. But with both anxiety and depression, one thing that I can think of that directly relates to stress and talking about attention and learning is it distracts you. So if you're really anxious about something, or if you're really sad about something, you think about your emotions in a recurrent way that can really keep you from attending to something. So it just increases your cognitive load, and you're having to deal with all the other things going on in your head and your body.
And from a neuroscience perspective, I mean, for stress and anxiety and even depression, these are affecting this overlapping systems. So, think about like glucocorticoids and the hippocampus and the amygdala. So you're really putting a lot of load on a lot of these on overlapping circuits that can, cause problems in performance and attention.
Great. Okay, so we're near the end, and so I want to thank everybody who's been asking questions. I just want to remind you that if you didn't get your question answered, email me. You can find the email at the UT Brainstorms website, and if I can't answer it, I will forward it to somebody who can, probably Caitlin or Michael or Emma. So let's end with this, and so this is going to be one of these 10-second answer things. One of the most fascinating questions that we've had at Brainstorms was in our first season, and the topic was dementia and Alzheimer's. And the question was, don't give me the details, but as a neuroscientist, what do you do? So my question that let's end on is, as a neuroscientist, tell us something that you draw from neuroscience that's important for your day, that you bring to your daily life. I'll go first. Turns out high blood pressure is devastating to the brain. And we can talk about all these things, and you can learn new things and do crossword puzzles and play the guitar, but if you have high blood pressure, it's bad. So that's another one of these simple, you can control things. Do not let your blood pressure get out of control. So who's next?
I can go, and I have two things. I'm going to sound like a broken record, but there's exercise. The other part, though, is social interaction is also a really important thing. There's a lot of science to support that. So, I'm familiar with that as a neuroscientist, and that's something that, especially now is really, really helpful, even if you may not want to. Just small social interaction is really beneficial and stress relieving.
Good one. Great one. Yeah. Emma?
Yeah, so I've probably touched on this one a little too. But I think it's fascinating just how much eating can actually affect us. There is plenty of research looking at different peptides that are involved in both hunger and satiety that affect stress, but that's related to everything we've been talking about. So little daily things, eating good, healthy food in a regular pattern actually makes me feel so much better.
Great. Michael? Don't say tennis. Don't say tennis.
I hope none of my tennis buddies are watching tonight. um, yeah, I mean, I always I think of my brain as another part of my body, and so I try to take care of my body, and that means doing everything that Emma and Caitlin said, and I don't think there are any magical secrets there, except for, I mean, also using it, and that means challenging yourself and actually going out and doing stuff. And I think so, like Caitlin said, social interactions. Those are probably one of the most complex challenges out there for your brain, maybe for your body as well.
Yeah, just to connect what you guys said, there's a lot of evidence that a big part of the cognitive decline with aging is people start doing fewer things and having interactions with fewer people. So it's a great one. It's a great suggestion for older people as well. That's something you have control over and you can work at. So folks, thank you so much. Michael, Caitlin, Emma, fantastic. I know this is a big ask. Thank you so much for being here. You guys did a great job. Thank you to the audience. One more time, if you didn't get your question answered, email me and we'll get it taken care of. I hope you join us in November for the one on the implications of COVID on neural health. And everybody be safe and tell a friend and see you next time, right?
Bye.
Thank you guys, did a great job.